Okay, part 3. So part 3, we are calling identifying the pathogenic parenting that's underlying the crisis in the family and domestic violence courts. So already seen all of this. We've talked about all of this. We don't need to go over high conflict family court cases again. Okay, so to sum it up, what we are talking about is that in high conflict cases, a child will often reject one parent for a variety of offered reasons. Anytime that a child is rejecting a parent, anytime, for any reason, that is a severe attachment pathology. We are looking at an attachment pathology. And so the differential diagnosis for clinicians to be looking at is possible child abuse by one parent or the other. So it is either going to result in a diagnosis of child neglect, child physical abuse, child sexual abuse, or child psychological abuse. And we're going to be focusing, obviously, on the child psychological abuse. It's really important to understand that cases that involve a child rejecting a parent, and this happens, for severe neglect or physical or sexual abuse. Those cases are typically going to be handled by Child Protective Services. And those cases are typically, at least here in the US, going to be handled in a completely different court, the juvenile courts, the child protection courts. It is not going to be cases that involve two parents who are litigating custody of the child in the family courts. The cases that are in the family courts where you've got two parents litigating against each other, those are more often going to involve child psychological abuse. Is there neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse in families that are in the family courts? Yes, that's conceivable, but they are not going to be the majority of the cases. So to boil it down, from family systems and personality pathologies, child psychological abuse is of concern in high conflict custody litigation because you've got a dark personality parent who's under severe stress from the divorce, who has developed a non-bizarre encapsulated persecutory delusion. They have triangulated the child into the spousal conflict. They have formed a cross-generational coalition against the other parent, created an inverted family hierarchy. They induced a persecutory delusional disorder in the child that is resulting in an emotional cutoff in the child's attachment bond to the targeted parent. Dr. Childress likes to call this the 3-person triangular attribution of causality for the parent-child conflict with the targeted parent. Okay, so Dr. Childress has identified 3 diagnostic indicators. One is the attachment suppression, which is a child is rejecting a normal range parent. And what's important before we can even get to this diagnostic indicator 1 is that a assessment of the rejected or targeted parent's parenting has been done to rule out the possibility of severe neglect, physical abuse, sexual abuse. So again, there are these parenting styles that incorporate a lot of different things to say, okay, well, maybe one parent is more permissive and the other is more structured, but the parent is not going into abusive range of over permissiveness or over authoritarianism or over neglect. So once we've established that, then diagnostic indicator 2 is going to be high protest behavior towards the targeted parent. That can appear as either high anger or high anxiety, or even some cases, even both. The high anger is defined as, it goes back to the narcissistic personality traits of grandiosity, lack of empathy, entitlement, arrogance, and splitting or dichotomous or black and white thinking about the targeted parent. So this is not saying that the child has narcissistic personality disorder. It's saying that the child is reflecting these traits from the allied parent. The high anxiety protest behavior is going to be when a child is showing like a phobic level fear of a normal range parent. And diagnostic indicator 3 is the persecutory delusion, and that's that the child has developed an encapsulated persecutory delusion about the rejected parent. So this defines this pathology in the child as being in the domain of attachment pathology and also induced delusional disorder pathology. So the associated clinical signs, there are 12. Every one of them derives from established professional knowledge from the fields of attachment research, personality disorder pathology, and family systems constructs. So these don't just come out of the blue in comparison to, say, for example, parental alienation. Parental alienation hooks into absolutely nothing from any established professional knowledge in psychology whatsoever. It is just completely made up criteria. Some of it's based on the child's behaviors, some of it's based on the other parent's behaviors, and this is why it's such a problem. The associated clinical signs are often, but they are not always present with the pathology. They are absolutely not diagnostic. In other words, you can have a child showing all 12 of these associated clinical signs, but if the child does not meet the 3 diagnostic criteria, it is not this pathology. So in other words, if the child is not rejecting a parent, but is showing all of these associated clinical signs, it's not child psychological abuse. It's something else going on with the child, but it's not this. The associated clinical signs provide further support for the diagnostic pattern surrounding the child's psychological abuse by a dark personality parent for the purposes of secondary gain, of manipulating the child-related court orders, and meeting the pathological parent's own emotional and psychological needs. So this lists all 12 of the clinical signs. Use of the word forced. The child is empowered to reject a parent. The child excludes a parent from their activities and milestone events. The child rejects ownership of the parent, or a parent is replaced by, say, for example, not calling that parent mom or dad anymore, now calling a step parent or a boyfriend or even a grandparent mom or dad. I've seen that happen. The child uses an unforgivable past event to justify rejecting a parent. The child uses the words liar or fake to describe a parent. The child uses characteristic themes to justify rejecting a parent. So the rejected parent is too controlling or too angry, too irresponsible, too neglectful, insufficiently apologetic, or even has a new romantic partner. The parent or child uses the word abuse in an unwarranted manner. The child engages in excessive communication by text or telephone, email, messaging with one parent while in the care of the other parent. Child displays a role reversal with a parent. This will most often come out from the allied parent actually saying, it's not me who, it's the child who. So what they're doing is they're reversing the role of who's in charge of the situation. The parent or child asserts that a parent deserves to be rejected, and the parent or child disregards court orders as to custody, visitation, and so on. Okay, so this was an actual study that we ran of an archival data set that we received from Dorcy Pruter through the Conscious Co-Parenting Institute. This was her custody resolution method. Our predictions were, or our question was, what is going to be the prevalence of each associated clinical sign in a sample, which was her data set, when all 3 diagnostic indicators are also met? And we had 2 hypotheses, and one was that when all 3 diagnostic indicators are present, at least 4 of the associated clinical signs would also be present. And the second one was that each individual ACS would demonstrate a 50 to 90% prevalence in the data set. Grab my charger. Okay, here we go. The method was, we had 46 families who were involved with high conflict custody litigation. 24 were rejected fathers, 22 were rejected mothers. I love to point this out. It's almost equal numbers. This is not just a father's issue. It's not just a mother's issue. This happens to everybody. Family sizes ranged from 1 to 7 children. Children's ages ranged from 5 to 26. That's because considering blended families, considering that, there are older children. So the families had previously participated in the custody resolution method and given their voluntary consent for CCPI to use their information in future research studies. So the custody resolution method uses a qualitative, and I know that this is getting kind of scientific, but basically it uses content analysis. It looks at the quality of things that will show up in court-generated documents like emails and texts and mental health reports and educational reports, audio and video recordings, and court records themselves. We basically got a memorandum of understanding with CCPI, and we got Institutional Review Board approval. So this was an IRB approved study. We did have to exclude any families that were in the sample that they did not have at least one child who met all 3 diagnostic indicators. We were only looking at families that met all 3 diagnostic indicators. But I think we only had to exclude maybe 2 or 3 families. Okay, so these were the results. The prevalence of each associated clinical sign was calculated, and the total number found in each family ranged from 5 all the way up to 12. So in the next couple of screens, we'll talk about the actual prevalence of each particular ACS and what it was. Most families showed from 9 to 11 associated clinical signs each, and all 46 of the families displayed at least 5. So our prediction was supported. All 46 families in high conflict family court cases displayed at least 5. And remember, we had predicted only 4. So our prediction that there would be a frequent co-occurrence of the ACSs when all 3 DI are met was supported. The prevalence ranged from 30% for one single associated clinical sign, and that was for excessive communications, all the way up to 100% for 3 of the associated clinical signs. And those 3 were that the child is empowered to reject the parent, there are characteristic themes justifying the rejection, and the parent deserves rejection. Now, 11 out of 12 of the associated clinical signs met the 50 to 90% prevalence threshold. So 6 of 12 associated clinical signs exceeded the predicted 90% prevalence. So half of the ACSs appear more than 90% of cases. And that's going to be child is empowered to reject a parent, 100%. The unforgivable event, 96% of cases. Characteristic themes justifying rejection, 100%. The child's role reversal, 96%. Parent deserves to be rejected, 100%. And disregard of court orders is 93%. So from this, our recommendations are that mental status exams of thought and perception should be conducted during diagnostic assessments for possible delusional thought disorders, and that future research identifying the 3 diagnostic indicators and 12 associated clinical signs should be done with direct clinical assessments rather than the content analysis from documents that are generated in family conflict, that it would probably end up being even more accurate if it's done by a clinician rather than by data coders just going off of documents. And that additional research systematically collecting the clinical assessment data for the 3 diagnostic indicators and 12 associated clinical signs in families involved in high conflict family court cases would provide confirmation of and adjustment to the diagnostic model that Dr. Childress has given us. Those are my references. And again, just that last